Many years ago, historian David Lowenthal wrote a book called The Past is a Foreign Country. In the book, he explores the question of how should we view the people of the ancient past? When we're talking about peoples and civilizations from hundreds or even thousands of years ago, maybe before we do anything, we have to wrap our minds around this question of what we can say about them and what we can't say about them. So the question is the study of ancient peoples really a look into people that are so remote, so alien, that we could never truly understand them? Is the historical context they lived in something that we could never understand with our advancements and technologies and all of the changes that have happened in the world over hundreds or thousands of years? Are we so interwoven with our own culture that because of that cultural soup we've all grown up in, we can't bring our minds outside of that cultural context and truly understand what it might have been like to live hundreds or thousands of years ago? Does our experience of the present permanently shade and prevent us from truly understanding the past? Someone who answers yes to that question might also caution people from the present from assigning their moral values and their understanding of history and economics and right and wrong onto the people of the past. An alternative perspective might say that we can grant most or all of that we do need to be careful assigning our modern sensibilities onto the peoples of the past, but it's also true that the people of the past were still human beings, and we share certain things with the peoples of the past that make us all deeply human. And the assumption should be that the same things that motivate us now, the same love and hate, the same struggles with insecurities and desires for power, psychological and contextual motivations for behavior, these are the things that all humans will always deal with. So according to this perspective, we shouldn't necessarily view the peoples of the past as alien and outsider, but we should look at them as human and try to understand the human motivations behind their actions, even if we can't fully understand the contextual soup that they were swimming in. I think both perspectives have value, and there's elements of truth in both of these perspectives of how to view people in the past. But what's interesting is that if you do believe that in many ways the people of the past are the same human beings that we are today, just living in a different moment, then it's also true that the cultural lens of the present affects how we look at the past. And it also affects the methods and the techniques that we use to make judgments about the past and to study anything from history to begin with. For example, when we look at Spanish writings from the 1500s or the 1600s, when we look at their writings about the Aztec and the Mexica people and their history, we have to keep in mind that the present moment for the Spanish at that time may have been a justification for the colonial mission and the spreading of empire and the spreading of Christianity. We also have to understand that Mexica writings from the 1500s or the 1600s may have been colored by their present moment of trying to come to grips with the fall of the Aztec Empire and the takeover of the Spanish, and so on and so forth. As the histories continue to get written, a good historian, in my opinion, understands not just the facts and the truth of the events that happened in the past, but also the cultural context of the present moment whenever those histories were written. And as we've said, over the years, the story of the Mexica people and the story of the Aztec Empire eventually largely came to revolve around ideas of superstition and human sacrifice and lack of understanding of modern warfare due to the ritual nature of their religion and some of these sort of barbarian style traits that we've been talking about. And what modern historians of the Aztec Empire are looking to do is pump the brakes on those sort of narratives and re-examine the Aztec and the Mexica people as human beings. And I think this is an important and right assumption to start from. These people were human beings. We have to understand what were their psychological motivations for doing what they did. We have to assume that, like modern human beings and like the human beings of the past and other cultures that we study, people are motivated to make decisions based on their own best interest and practicality and the histories that came before them and the cultural and political environment of the moment. And perhaps these very human, political, economic, social motivations are actually what's motivating the Aztec behavior and not necessarily superstition or ritual. We have to understand that the Aztec Empire at its height was made up of human beings. And collectively, they created a flourishing civilization that would rival any civilization in any historical tradition. They had a sophisticated government and state apparatus. There's a bureaucracy, there's tribute systems, there's complex war strategizing and punishments for going against the state. There is economic exchange, long-distance trade, farming, the spread and trade of luxury goods. There's huge monumental architecture. There's music and culture and religion, a little bit of writing. And again, this was a advanced and flourishing civilization. And we're not saying necessarily that any of this stuff is good or bad. What we're doing is we're trying to humanize the people of the Aztec Empire and understand where they came from and why the decisions they made happened, and ultimately how those decisions and the arrival of the Spanish led to their downfall. And all the while, we're juxtaposing this idea of maybe that stereotypical view of the Aztecs, of these savage, superstitious people that were easily annihilated by the Spanish, who simply were a more advanced civilization. There's kernels of truth in that narrative, but in the long run, it leaves a lot to be desired as far as a historical explanation. So all of that being said, what was life like on the island, the city of Tenochtitlan? Historians in the modern day seem to think that the population of Tenochtitlan was probably around 50,000 at its height. And if you include Tenochtitlan and the surrounding city-states that the Aztec Empire controlled around Lake Texcoco, you're probably looking at about 1.5 million people. Walking along the streets, you would have seen the sophisticated fishing and farming operations that the Aztec were known for. You would have seen the chinampas, or the floating gardens, where the Aztecs did much of their agriculture. You would have heard music being played. We know this was important to the Aztecs. On the skyline, you would have seen humongous temples, monumental architecture connected to religion and state power. There were aqueducts made of clay that took water from far-off places and led them to the palace where the emperor lived. The palace had this incredible zoo, and gardens that people could go and visit, where they had animals and birds from far off lands on display as a show of power and prestige. There were also humans on display, maybe a show of fear, power, and prestige there, which we know is not abnormal from the Aztecs. If you were walking along the streets of Tenochtitlan on a holy day, you might have seen religious ceremonies happening at one of these monumental temples. We know that these ceremonies often involved human sacrifice and sometimes sex, maybe even homosexual intercourse. This wouldn't be unfamiliar to anyone who knows much about ancient religious ceremonies across cultures. But anyway, one of the things that strikes the Spaniards in particular when they show up in Tenochtitlan is how neatly designed the city is. You have a section for the giant temples and the giant pyramids, and then you have the palace area and the section for houses of the noble families, then your common households, and everything was neatly organized. The streets were aligned in a grid fashion, and the Mexica could do all of this because, remember, they showed up in Tenochtitlan and decided, hey, here's where we're going to build our city, and they planned it out. The Spanish were, of course, surprised because we know many European cities at the time kind of grew organically. And this haphazard growth led to, let's just say, some poor urban planning and design. The Aztec collected urine and waste in a central location at their market, and this helped keep the rest of the city clean. And they also used that stuff to help in the production of things like tanning hides and salt crystals, a sort of ancient recycling apparatus. Tenochtitlan, with its huge population and its huge population of people and cities that it could draw from as tribute states, and its geographic location at the center of Lake Texcoco, made it a hub of trade and long-distance trade at that. There were bustling markets in the city. People came from far and wide to buy and sell food, trinkets, jewelry, luxury items, and more. Women in Aztec society could and did work in these markets as buyers and sellers. And listen to this description by Camilla Townsend of the markets in Tenochtitlan. Quote, "One part of the market featured luxury goods, gold and silver, turquoise, jade, and other gems, the feathers of exotic birds. Merchants sold these to artisans as raw materials and to wealthy customers as finely crafted textiles and beautiful jewelry. Likewise, they sold plain cotton thread or cloth and also beautifully made embroidered cloaks and other clothing. In another area, they offered firewood and lumber, as well as wood carved into tool handles, paddles, and columns for buildings. They sold copper axe heads and needles, white bark paper, pitch pine for torches, rubber balls, herbal medicines, tobacco, pipes, and row upon row of ceramic pots and dishes. They hawked goods made of sisal, twine, rope, nets, and sandals, as well as all manner of animal furs, tanned or untanned, dyed or undyed. They sold rough grinding stones and fine obsidian knives or mirrors in which one could see every detail of one's face. In one corner, men could pay to have their hair cut. In another, they could buy a slave or find a prostitute." End quote. Spaniard Bernal Diaz was there in Tenochtitlan when the conquest happened, and he later wrote about his experience in the markets. He said, quote, "We were astounded at the great number of people and the quantities of merchandise, and at the orderliness and good arrangements that prevailed, for we had never seen such a thing before. The chieftains who accompanied us pointed everything out. Every kind of merchandise was kept separate and had a fixed place marked for it." End quote. What's interesting is that for a long time, historians thought that the Aztecs didn't really engage in much long-distance trade. And you could extend this to other Mesoamerican civilizations that came before them as well. But more modern scholarship has actually uncovered a fairly sophisticated network of long-distance trade that did exist during the time period. It wasn't necessarily a Silk Road as far as volume or variety of goods, but there were serious trade networks, and oftentimes Tenochtitlan was the hub of the wheel. Anthropologists Nicholas Scholes and Blanca Maldonado investigated the archaeological remains of the Templo Mayor. This was the primary temple in the city of Tenochtitlan, a huge pyramid-looking structure. And what Scholes and Maldonado found was that there were metals, and some of these metals, whether it was gold or copper, had come from far distant regions in Mesoamerica. So these metals were valued spiritually, but also practically. Jewelry, textiles, these could be used as symbols of power when wearing them. And we can see that trinkets, necklaces, hatchets, ingots, and more were traded through this site at the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan. Scholes and Maldonado used the ancient Mexica sources as well as the Spanish sources and their archaeological findings to determine that some of this gold and copper probably arrived at the pyramid at Templo Mayor through a couple of different ways. They say, quote, "spoils of war that are directly offered upon return from the battlefield, priests obtaining the offerings on the market, tributes being offered directly, tribute being redistributed and reworked by local artisans before being offered." End quote. Historian Camilla Townsend, in her book Fifth Son, offers further support for this idea of long-distance trade in the Aztec Empire. She says, quote, "they facilitated trade with the eastern realms, buying textiles and cocoa, beautiful shells, the plumages of rare birds, and eventually the birds themselves, as well as other luxury goods. They sold these in exchange for the goods made by Tenochtitlan's craftsmen, as well as excess slaves from the wars launched by the Mexica and their allies, women and children who had not been sacrificed, but rather turned over to long-distance merchants." End quote. That reminder there from Camilla Townsend that people could be traded as slaves as well reminds us that although these long-distance trade networks existed, the Aztec probably preferred to get their prisoners of war and their tributary goods from their tribute system, which meant warfare. But Camilla Townsend did mention the birds that flew around Tenochtitlan. And this is actually one of the first things that the Spanish noticed when they entered the city in 1519. Because we talked about the flowers and the gardens and the zoos that were in the palace, but even the roofs of ordinary people's houses had these incredible gardens and flowers that attracted all types of birds and insects. And when the city was in bloom, it must have been an incredible sight to behold. Camilla Townsend also talks about the food that was available in Tenochtitlan and how people who came from far off distances to pay tribute to the emperor and then ate a meal were often stunned by what they saw and tasted. listen to this description from Camilla Townsend. You could literally substitute this into George R.R. Martin's description of feasts that happen in A Song of Ice and Fire, because it sounds like the stuff of fantasy. Camilla Townsend says, quote, "Their host offered them food and they feasted. The tamales boasted decorative designs on top, such as a seashell outlined with red beans. Guests could choose between turkey, venison, rabbit, lobster, or frog stewed with chilies of various kinds. On the side, there were winged ants with savory herbs, spicy tomato sauces, fried onions and squash, fish eggs, and toasted corn. There were all kinds of fruits, tortillas with honey, and little cakes made of amaranth seed. Indeed, a former servant once counted 2,000 different dishes made for the Mexica king and then passed on to be sampled by his counselors, servants, and entertainers. At the very end of the meal always came chocolate, crushed cacao beans steeped in hot water and flavored with honey and various kinds of dried flowers, such as vanilla pods or roses. To render it even more special, the drink was served in carved or painted gourds, often from faraway lands." End quote. Now, granted, this type of meal was probably only reserved for the emperor and certain noble families, but we get the idea. While the nobles enjoyed probably the better food, the streets and markets of Tenochtitlan had what we might call pop-up food stands, or the ancient equivalent of food trucks today. Pre-made food items were available for consumption from the common people. Meanwhile, upper-class men could also take multiple wives and concubines from enemies captured during warfare. The lower class, however, typically lived with their family in one husband and one wife households. Sometimes there were other family members in the house, or there were multi-generational members in the house. Houses were mostly made of adobe clay and lined the streets in orderly fashion. Husband and wife each had separate areas of the house to their own. The woman's area typically associated with supplies for cooking, cleaning, maintenance of the gardens, and the men had a special area where they would often hang weapons and mementos of war. In a world of shifting city-state alliances and consistent raiding and tribute, women had the job of keeping children on their toes and ensuring that they were ready to make sacrifices for the good of the city and the good of the Mexica people. It was their job to teach their children to do their duty. Boys and girls went to temple-run schools where they both learned the expectations of them. Typically, girls were taught how to raise families and produce children that could contribute to Aztec conquests and the Aztec religion. Girls could also learn how to work in the household and be part of the bustling markets that we described earlier. Boys had a little bit more of an option. They could go into the war track where they could become warriors and try to achieve honors and rise up the ranks of Aztec society that way, or they could go into the priesthood. And as the size of the Aztec Empire is growing, the size of the priesthood is growing as well, and some might even argue the relative power of religion in Aztec society. As they gain more tributes and more captured prisoners of war, human sacrifice on a monthly basis becomes more ritualized and more integrated into the bureaucracy and the state apparatus, and it becomes more formalized. And there's no doubt that a big part of this system of human sacrifice was used as a way to instill fear and obedience in the city-states around them. They would bring people from other places, maybe places that they hadn't conquered yet, simply to watch what would happen at these ceremonies and report back what they saw. This is what happens if you go against Tenochtitlan. And while all of this is happening at the local level, this is what life was like in Tenochtitlan for the average family. The Aztec state was hard at work integrating their cultural lifestyle with the political realities of Mesoamerica at the time. Politically speaking, the Aztec leaders used a combination of war and force and tribute and maybe fear of human sacrifice to keep the other city-states in line, but they also used diplomacy where needed, like we talked about with the Flower Wars last episode, which were somewhat of a mixture between warfare and diplomacy. And they also used polygyny. Obviously, this has been something we've noted in the upper class families of the Mexica noble lines. We talked last episode about Itzcoatl and how he came from the slave wife of his father. And the Aztec would use the children of noble lines or royal lines to assign to be married to strategic city-states in different locations in order to make alliances and avoid warfare if necessary. Last episode, we also talked about Itzcoatl's idea of rotating power between the family lines of the ruler. So if the ruler had children from multiple wives, the next leader would rotate between different sides of the family. And to some extent, this system also applies at the lower levels of Aztec society. One historian called this idea the cellular principle. And the idea is that first you have your family, and that family might pay tribute or have marriage alliances to a more kin-based clan on a higher level. That kin-based clan might make allegiances to what the Aztec called a altepet, which basically means a city-state. And then that city-state might have tributary and marriage alliances and warfare deals with a greater altepet, which in this case would be Tenochtitlan at the top of the food chain. Unpleasant tasks and pleasant tasks, as well as power positions and important duties, were rotated within families, within kin groups, within city-states to hopefully achieve harmony between the local family unit and that unit's place in this larger cellular system. And if you're thinking this integration between the social lives of the Mexica people and that integration with the greater Aztec state network is complicated, you would be right. As the population is growing in the Aztec Empire, and as families are trying to figure out which noble families they pay tribute to, and noble families are trying to scheme which side of the family they want to be associated with which city-state, things can very quickly get very complicated. One Mexica woman in the late 1500s remembers life back in the late 1400s, saying, quote, "Back when I was growing up, there was an infinite number of nobles. How many noble houses there were, the palaces of those who were nobles and rulers. It was like one big palace. There were countless minor lords and lesser relatives, and one could not count the commoners, who were their dependents, or the slaves. They were like ants." End quote. So this cellular principle of tribute between family and kin-based groups and larger noble families and city-states and the greater altepets, obviously we can see the complexities there, but the system worked for a long time. and it ensured a stake in the larger system from each individual common family. By the time Moctezuma II came to power, maybe around 1503, the Aztec Empire was a fully functioning modern state in the way that a European at the time would have totally understood. There was a bureaucracy with government officials, tribute collectors who measured out exact tribute amounts from exact city-states and places. They had officials in local provinces in charge of regulating laws and tribute. There was a chain of command that was all tightly ordered and documented. We talked about the trade over long distances. Diplomacy and marriage negotiations happened at the local and state level. Land reform, standardization of calendars, and judgments and laws, not always written down. Sometimes the tax collectors or religious priests used pictograms to depict events, but not in a phonetic language that people like the Spanish would understand. But a lot of these laws and tribute systems were recorded in ledgers or normatively understood. But while the system of the state was working to create this flourishing empire from a big picture perspective, anytime you have a large state like this, there's always going to be drawbacks, and there's going to be people who are left out, and there's going to be people who are oppressed. Think about all the slaves that the Aztec Empire took as tribute, prisoners of war, sent in chains back to the Templo Mayor to be sacrificed in front of a public spectacle. Think about their families and the kin-based groups that they came from and the resentments that might entail. Think about the marriage alliances that got snubbed. Think about the people that emperors like Moctezuma executed when they went outside the reigns of Aztec power. One Nahua poem from very long ago encapsulates this idea of the losers of empire and the feelings of bitterness and betrayal that happen as a result. Camilla Townsend quotes the poem as saying, quote, "My heart is angry. We are not born twice, not engendered twice. Instead, we leave this earth forever. We are in the presence of this company but a moment. It can never be. I will never be happy, never be content. Where does my heart live? Where is my home? Where does my house lie? I suffer on this earth." End quote. It would be dangerous to read a poem like this out loud. But with the fragility of life and death in the balance, you can see that many people in the Aztec Empire were probably looking or maybe even waiting for an alternative. And you never know when history will turn on a dime. In 1517, somewhere along the Yucatan Peninsula, a couple 100 miles east of Tenochtitlan, a couple of people from the people known as the Chantal Maya stood on the beach and looked out into the Gulf. What they saw amazed and probably confused them. They saw boats about 100 times larger than the canoes they typically traveled in. They saw giant cloth sails powering these ships and intimidating them. They saw men with strange beards, and their clothing gleamed in the sunlight, somewhat mystically. the Spanish had arrived. If you enjoyed this episode, you can subscribe on Patreon for bonus episodes and other perks. You can also join the Patreon for free to get a monthly recommendations email and a sneak peek at what's up next. You can support in other ways, of course, by leaving a rating or review in your podcast app, by following on social media, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, etc., by sharing with a friend, or simply by continuing to listen. You can also sign up for the email newsletter that I've been working on. Links to all of this stuff are in the show notes. Any comments or suggestions you can send to reflectinghistory@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. As always, that's it for now.